Hello and welcome everybody to the third of our 4 classes with tour guide extraordinaire Shulie Mishkin. Shulie has taken us so far to Akko and Tzfat, and you have not even left your seat in Montreal. This is an amazing tour, and once again we're in for a treat today with the third of our 4 sessions, which is Hebron and Gush Etzion. It is my pleasure and indeed treat to be able to hand over to Shulie.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Fishman. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. This is one of my favorite classes to do because, full disclosure, I live in Gush Etzion, so it's always nice for me to be able to share where I live. And Hebron, of course, is our neighbor down the road, not far away. So this is a local tours for me. So I titled this "The Path of the Fathers and the Mothers." If we want to go back to biblical times, Second Temple times, even after that, this is the place where Jewish history is happening. Here in the mountains, we're going to see that along the way. We're going to talk about the path of the patriarchs. But the land of Judah, the places between Bethlehem and Hebron, okay, those are the places that so many of the stories of Tanakh are happening, whether it's about the patriarchs and the matriarchs, or about King David, or later on when we have the Second Temple period, or the Bar Kokhba revolt. So many of our stories are coming from this area, and so we really are going back to visit our fathers and our mothers. Of course, when we go to Hebron, the iconic place to go is what you're seeing in the picture here. And that's Marat HaMachpelah, the cave of the patriarchs. And we're going to be getting to that. But first, we want to do a little bit of an overview of where we are, the region, and the roads to it, and some of the more ancient and contemporary history. Okay, so first, let's understand where we are in the land. Okay, so we are going to be talking about Hebron, which is down here. We're going to be talking about Gush Etzion, which is in the area kind of between Bethlehem and Hebron, so right about here. Okay, all of this area, right, what today is called Route 60, is more or less, and I say more or less because with current political realities, things have changed somewhat, but this is more or less the ancient path of the patriarchs, okay? The path, Derech HaAvot, we're going to talk about it, that goes through the mountains, starting from down in Beersheba area, going Hebron, Beit Lechem, past Jerusalem, Beit El, Shiloh, Shechem. This is the heartland of the Jewish nation. This is where the stories are happening, and we're going to be concentrating on the southern portion of that area, not all the way down to Beersheba, but down to Hebron. Okay, so that's just to understand where we are. We are in the mountains of Judea, Hare Yehuda. We're going to see the tribes in a moment, where the tribes are. Okay, just to the east of us is the desert, Judean desert, Midbar Yehuda. To the west of us are the hills, the lowlands, Shvelat Yehuda. So this is all part of the tribe of Judah, but very different topography. Here we are in the mountains. Okay? Ask anyone who lives here. One of the main great reasons to live here is we have really nice weather. Okay? And in the summertime, even when it's hot and disgusting, which it was today, right? About now, beautiful, right? Go outside, it's beautiful. That's the great advantage of living in the mountains. Okay. Just to take a quick look at our tribes, we've done this before, right? We spent time 2 weeks ago in Akko, up here in the tribe of Asher. Last week we were in Tzfat in the tribe of Naphtali. With all due respect to these tribes, these are not the major tribes that we hear about in Tanakh. They're not the major players. The major players are here in the center of the country, and there's no more major player than Judah, right? The tribe of Judah, which has a very, very large tribal area, going all the way, technically all the way to the sea, even though in biblical times they didn't go all the way to the sea because the Philistines were in control, and for a large part of First Temple times, Judah was not able to conquer this area, but still technically, Judah goes all the way to the sea and all the way to the desert, right? A whole long span from west to east, and also going all the way from part of Jerusalem. Okay, Judah controls half of Jerusalem, Benjamin controls the rest, going from part of Jerusalem all the way down into the Negev desert. So Judah is a very powerful, very large tribe. The settlement in the land of Judah increases amazingly when the Jews come into land, right? From archaeological surveys that we have of the sites in the area of the Judean hills, of the mountains here, okay, before the time period of Joshua, right, before, give or take, the 12th century, before the Common Era, you have about one settlement per 200 kilometers. After the time of Joshua, after the children of Israel entered the land, you have one settlement per 30 kilometers, okay, one per 200, jumping to a density of 1 per 30. That's a lot more dense. That's a lot more communities. We're not talking about big cities. We're talking about small farming communities, but many, many, many of them. It's very hard to wander around the area of Gush Etzion and Hebron and the Judean hills without coming across some kind of archaeological remains of a town from First Temple or Second Temple times. Judah is blessed with having vines, right? Osrela, Geffen, Iro, that's the blessing that he gets from Jacob, from the patriarch Jacob. You're going to tie your donkey to the grapevines, okay? He's also blessed with having flocks of goat shinayim, right? Goats and sheep, right? It says, Chachlile einayim miyayin. You're going to have red eyes from wine, veloven shinayim mechalav. You're going to have white teeth from all the milk you're going to drink. So we get a sense of pasture land. We get a sense of grapevines, right? Of vineyards and wine. And anyone who drives around the area of Gush Etzion and Har Hebron and the mountains of Hebron, you see vineyards everywhere, right? Vines grow here. You don't even have to plant them; they grow, right? This is something that is very, very indigenous to the region of Judah. So it's a region that's blessed with a lot of archaeology, a lot of agriculture, right? A lot of important agriculture. What we mentioned before, the path of the patriarchs, okay? In ancient times, there are various important roads that traverse the land of Israel. In ancient times, the land of Israel is not so much a destination, right? We are a connector between the great empires of Egypt down here, right? And the empires of Mesopotamia up here. People want to get from one to the other. Some important stuff happens in the land of Israel. That's true. But most of the people who are traveling through, right? This is not a destination. So what are the main roads? We have the sea road, the Via Maris, right? That comes up from Egypt. Derech Hayam, it's called in Hebrew, goes up and then crosses by the Jezreel Valley and goes out towards the kingdoms in the northeast. We have Derech HaMelech, the King's Highway, that goes up the Transjordan. But what about traversing inside the country itself? That's this blue path, and that's the path of the patriarchs, what's called Derech HaAvot. And this is, why is it called the path of the patriarchs? Because when we read about the places that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob go to, where are they going? This is where they're going, right? Abraham comes into the land. He stops in Elon Moreh, which is near Shechem. He continues towards Beit El. From there, he continues on towards Hebron and Beersheba. When Jacob runs away from Esau, he runs from Beersheba up to Beit El and out. When he returns years later with his wives and children, he comes into Shechem, Beit El, right? They're always traveling on this route. This is the route. This is called the path of the patriarchs. It's on the ridge of the mountain. It's on the watershed. We found pieces of the ancient Roman road that's built here centuries after the time of the patriarchs. The Romans tended to build in the same places where there were roads already. And in Gush Etzion, we actually have Roman milestones, as well as, we'll see in a minute, an ancient Jewish mikvah on this road, a ritual bath. So this is a very significant path that's connecting the mountain territories, okay? We are going to go to Hebron. Okay, where are we going to go in Hebron? So we'll see in a minute how Hebron is divided between Israel and the Palestinians. But the areas that we are going to visit are primarily in the area that's controlled by Israel. Okay, we are obviously going to go to Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of the patriarchs, okay? And we are really going to focus on the Jewish history in Hebron. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking about here. Obviously, there is history of the Muslims, history of the Christians. We're going to focus on the Jewish history. Okay, we're going to take a look at Beit Hadassah over here, very important in terms of the return of Jews to Hebron. We're going to look at the Avraham Avinu Synagogue, which is not on my map here, but is basically right about here. Okay, and we're going to go up to the ancient Tel of Hebron, the ancient site of Hebron, Tel Rumeida, as well as the cemetery. Okay, this map is not particularly helpful in understanding topography, okay, but just understand that Tel Rumeida and the cemetery are at the top of the hill. Okay, here's a nice mountain here. The cave of the patriarchs, all these other places are at the bottom of the hill. Okay, that's going to be important because we're going to talk about who lives where when. Right, and essentially the ancient city is at the top of the hill over here, and eventually in the Middle Ages the city switches and the city is at the bottom of the hill. Similarly, in ancient times, the cemetery, the burial places, is at the bottom of the hill. Later on, burial places are at the top of the hill. Where people are living, they don't bury, and vice versa. So we flip that at some point. So we'll keep that in mind as we go along. Okay. Timeline, why? Lots of timing. Okay, there's a lot of history in Hebron. Don't be intimidated, but we do want to have a basic understanding of the time periods we're talking about. Okay, so we want to go back to the period of the patriarchs, and of course the dates of the patriarchs, there's lots of controversies about dates. For our purposes, we're going to talk about around 1700 before the Common Era. That's the time period when Abraham is buying the cave of Machpelah. 700 or so years later, King David, when he becomes king, first he's king only over Judah, and Hebron is his capital. Eventually, he manages to unite the very fractious tribes, and he becomes king over all of Judah and Israel, and then his capital is Jerusalem. But he starts out in Hebron. First century before the Common Era, meaning towards the end of Second Temple times, Herod builds what today is that iconic building over the Machpelah cave, right? What we saw before that, sorry. Okay, the cave, the burials are earlier, but the building is from about 2,000 years ago. Okay, 4th through the 7th century, there are flourishing Jewish communities in the Hebron Hills, not necessarily in Hebron. Okay, 1100, the Crusaders conquer, they kick out the Muslims, the Jews are exiled from Hebron. Still, we have a visit by Maimonides to Hebron, who's very excited about that. In the 13th century, the Mamluks, the Muslims, conquer, kick out the Crusaders. They allow the Jews to return. So you have a Muslim return and a Jewish return. And at that point, a couple hundred years later, the Jews start to build at the bottom of the hill. Okay, they buy land, they build the Avraham Avinu Synagogue. Fast forward to the 19th century, we have a large presence of Chabad, right? Chabad in Lubavitch, they come and they strengthen the Jewish community in Hebron, and it grows and it gets bigger. The end of the 19th century, we have a Hadassah health clinic. We have Beit Hadassah that's built, and eventually when Hadassah is created, in the 20th century, they use this building as a health clinic. 1925, Hebron, Jewish Hebron is flourishing. The Slobodka yeshiva moves to Hebron. The city is growing, and all of this comes to a very shocking and terrible halt in 1929 with the Arab riots. Okay, Arab riots in lots of places in the land of Israel, but the very worst ones are in Hebron, and we'll come back to that. From that point, effectively the end of the Jewish community in Hebron. Jews are allowed to live in Hebron, but they really don't. And only in 1967 does Israel return to Hebron. And then we have a long saga that we'll talk about Jews coming back to live in Hebron, right? Israel becomes sovereign over Hebron in the Six-Day War, but living there takes a little bit longer, right? And that's where we'll get the story of Kiryat Arba, the women of Kiryat Arba, and finally Jewish settlement allowed in Hebron. Another terrible horrific event in 1994, this time from a Jew on a Muslim, Baruch Goldstein attacks Muslim worshippers at prayer in the Machpelah, in Marat HaMachpelah. And from that point on, that's the status today, the cave is divided between Jews and Muslims. Okay, and we'll talk about that as well, but that's unfortunately, an important milestone in Hebron, as well as 1997, when we have the Hebron Agreement, right, as kind of a corollary to the Oslo agreements. Not a corollary, but in addition to the Oslo agreements, where Hebron is divided up between Palestine and the Palestinians and the Israelis. Terror attacks, we could add many. This is unfortunately needs to be updated, this timeline, and Jewish housing in Tel Rumeida, Beit Menucha, but we'll come back to that. Okay, so that's our larger picture of a timeline. Thank you. Becky adds that the Baruch Goldstein massacre was on Purim, which led to repercussions on Purim for quite a few years afterwards, right? Arab attacks on Jews as revenge attacks from that story. Okay. In 1997, Benjamin Netanyahu makes an agreement dividing Hebron, as opposed to the other Oslo agreements. The rest of the Oslo agreements, where cities like Ramallah, Jenin, Shechem are given over wholly to the Palestinians. Hebron, because of the Jews who are living there, and because of the importance of the Cave of the Patriarchs, Hebron is divided. Okay, as you can see from the division, the lion's share of Hebron is what's called H1. H1 is Area A. It's a Palestinian area. Jews are not allowed to live there. Israeli citizens are not allowed to go in there unless you're a soldier. So that is completely off limits. 85% of Hebron is H1, is Palestinian controlled and lived in, and Jews are not allowed in there. 15% of Hebron is H2, Israeli controlled, but out of that 15%, only 3% is set aside for Jewish settlement. So that's important to understand. When people talk about Jews taking over in Hebron and stopping the Arab presence in Hebron, it's a very, very small part of Hebron. Hebron has it's hard to know exact numbers. There are a lot of different numbers that are quoted, but just to give you a little bit of a sense, one of the numbers that's often taken as authoritative is that there are 160,000 Arabs in Hebron. It's the largest Palestinian city. There are about 800 Jews. 160,000 versus 800. One of the things that I do when I take people to Hebron, we go up to the top of the hill, we go up to the top of Tel Rumeida, where you can see into Palestinian Hebron, and you could see how it's a very large, thriving, modern city. Not to say that there aren't problems in the Israeli-controlled part of Hebron with the Arabs and the Jews, but realize that that's only one part of the story, and that's important to understand. Let's go back to the older history. North of Hebron, we have a site called Elonim Mamre, which we know from Tanakh, we know from the Bible, is a place that Abraham hangs out. He has his buddies, Einar, Eshkol, and Mamre. In Second Temple times, this is an important site, but with the Bar Kokhba revolt in the second century of the Common Era, the Romans turned this area into a slave market where Jews are sold, and it loses any kind of holiness to Jews. It becomes something that's very disturbing to Jews. There's a church nearby from Byzantine times until Crusader times, and the belief by the Christians there is that this is where Eshel Avraham, this ancient tree that Abraham has his hospitality under, that's where it happens, over there. We want to go back to archaeology from the time of the patriarchs. For that, you have to go to the top of the hill, to the top of what's called Tel Rumeida, right? The hill of ashes, literally what it means in Arabic, but it's Tel Hebron. This is the ancient site, the ancient city of Hebron. Now, Hebron is a very frustrating place in terms of archaeology. On the one hand, clearly there is tons of archaeology. This is a very old and constantly lived in city. On the other hand, because it's densely populated and an urban area, and more importantly, B, because it's a political minefield, it's very hard to do any kind of archaeological excavations in Hebron. So here and there have some, but there's definitely much more that could be done. Up at the top of the hill, there was a building that was built in the 80s, Beit Menachem, we mentioned it. That's the building that's standing on these pillars here, Jewish building, Jewish apartment building. And when it was built, the Jews took the opportunity to excavate underneath, and they discovered the city wall that goes back to the time of Abraham, the beginnings of the road that goes back to the time of Abraham. Probably they didn't discover it because it's under a street, but probably the city gate. So when we talk about Abraham making his purchase of the land that Marat HaMachpelah is going to become, that he's buying this land so that his wife Sarah has a burial place, the transaction is happening up here. The land is at the bottom of the hill, but the transaction is at the top of the hill because that's where the people are living. And in fact, it says in the bargaining story between Abraham and Ephron the Hittite, says that the witnesses are those who are coming through the gate of the city, Kol Ba'ei Sha'ar Iro. Okay, and the gate of the city is right here. More recently, there have been some more excavations done nearby at this top of the hill, Tel Hebron. One of the things that's very exciting that was discovered there is what you see here on the right here, mikvaot, very large ritual baths, which tell you this was a Jewish community in Second Temple times. Mikvaot is a classic sign of a Jewish community of Second Temple times. We've also found houses from a house from First Temple times, handles from the tax handles, jar handles from the time of King Hezekiah, wine press from Byzantine times. This was clearly the place of the city for centuries upon centuries, from biblical times up until medieval times. So there's definitely much more to discover here, but even the little that we've discovered really tells us that this is ancient Hebron, and that's a very exciting thing. The other thing that we have at the top of the hill is the cemetery, not from biblical times, but from medieval times, right? So let's just reiterate that for a minute. In biblical times, in Second Temple times, in Byzantine times, people lived at the top of the hill. They buried at the bottom of the hill. For some reason, we don't really know why. In medieval times, Jews decided to buy land at the bottom of the hill, to build a new community down there with a synagogue, with houses, and to buy land at the top of the hill and to create a new cemetery. Right? And the Hebron cemetery at the top of the hill is from medieval times until modern times, has a lot of important rabbis up here, Rav Chizkiah Medini, the Chida, Rav Eliyahu Mani. These are some of the important scholars of the land of Israel. Why in Hebron? Not necessarily because they lived in Hebron, although some of them did, but because Hebron was such an important burial spot because of the patriarchs, right, and the matriarchs, people said, I want to be buried there too, right? There's a phrase, Lihi kaver im yishenei Hebron. I want to be buried with the sleepers of Hebron. Whenever you have, and this is true for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, perhaps for other religions as well, whenever you have an important figure being buried somewhere, other people want to be buried there as well, right? It's, I don't know, is it a sign that, monkey see, monkey do? Is it a feeling that there's like a merit to being buried near these holy people? I don't know, but that's what it is, right? So you have a lot of important people buried in the cemetery in Hebron. Of course, the victims of the 1929 riots, but another corollary, what happened in 1929 was that the Arabs came and desecrated much of the cemetery, and after 1929 as well, up until 1967, very difficult to restore the cemetery, because one of the things that the Chevra Kadisha, the burial societies in Hebron, did often was bury without names, right? They had booklets, right? They had pinkasim. They had these records of who was buried where, but for some reason the tradition became not to have a monument with names on it, which makes restoring things obviously even more difficult than they would be otherwise. And one of the chief person who's involved in restoring the cemetery was an Ole who came, an immigrant who came from the former Soviet Union, a physicist in the former Soviet Union. Then he came to Israel. He moved to Kiryat Arba, and he became involved in restoring the cemetery. His name was Professor Ben Zion Tavger. We're going to come across him again in the Avraham Avinu Synagogue, but he works very hard to restore the cemetery. One of the famous graves in the cemetery is actually not the grave of a rabbi, but the grave of a rebbitzin, of a woman. one of the sections in the cemetery is a Chabad section. Remember, we said Chabad comes in the 19th century to Hebron, really strengthens the community. This is kind of a separate section of the cemetery. It almost was given over in these Hebron talks. It was almost given to the Arabs, but as you may know, Chabad tends to have a lot of clout in the world, and they managed to pressure the government to include this part of the cemetery in the Jewish part of Hebron, and of course it should be. And the most famous grave in this part of the cemetery is of this woman, Menucha Rochel Slonim. Menucha Rochel was the daughter of the second Chabad Rebbe, Rav Dov Ber, and the granddaughter of the founder of Chabad, right, of Rav Shneur Zalman, the author of the Tanya. She lived a long life. She lived from 1798 to 1888. And she decides in middle age, she and her husband, to move to Hebron. And this is part of this idea of strengthening the Jewish community of Hebron. She becomes a very popular figure among the Jews and the Arabs. She becomes like the grandmother, and everybody comes to her for blessings and for help. And she becomes a very important figure in Hebron. And this is her grave, which is still very visited today. Another important grave and a very disturbing but important story is the grave of Avraham Yedidia Nachshon. As part of the return of the Jews to Hebron, okay, first, they were allowed to build the community of Kiryat Arba. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And one of the couples who lives in Kiryat Arba is Sarah and Baruch Nachshon. In 1975, they have a son who unfortunately dies as an infant. And at that point, Hebron and the Jewish cemetery of Hebron are off limits to the Jews. But Sarah Nachshon takes her infant son and she marches from Kiryat Arba into Hebron. There are soldiers that are stationed there to not allow Jews to come in, Israeli soldiers. And she's standing there, this grieving mother with her infant son. And she says, "Are you going to deny me bringing my son to the cemetery?" And of course they can't. And she comes into the cemetery in Hebron and she buries her son there. And she says, millennia ago, Abraham bought a plot for Sarah, his wife, and by doing so, he created Jewish settlement in Hebron. Today, I, Sarah, buy back Hebron for the Jews with the burial of my son, Abraham. And it's really a very crazy but powerful story. And from that point on, the cemetery returns to Jewish hands. Another story is a little lighter and is also a great story. It was a man named Avraham Abutbul in Morocco. He was born in 1876. When he's a youngish man, 35 in 1910, a shaliach from Hebron comes, right? Somebody comes raising money for the Jewish community of Hebron, 1910, very, very strong Jewish community. And he comes around and he goes to Avraham Abutbul, you should live Ad Mea V'Esrim, right, till 120. But when you die, you should have a burial plot in Hebron. And Avraham Abutbul, okay, I'll buy a burial plot, I give some money, I give some charity. He buys a burial plot in Hebron in 1910. He finally makes Aliyah in 1963. Okay, he's almost 90 years old, but in 1963, Hebron is in Jordan. What can we do? The money is gone. But Avraham Abutbul has the last laugh because he lives until 1983. He lives another 20 years, and he dies in 1983 at, I'm just going to do the math, 107, and he's buried in the rebuilt, the restored cemetery of Hebron. So that's the benefits of a long life. The Sephardic Jews come in the 16th century, or the expulsion from Spain. They come back to the land of Israel. They come and strengthen the Jewish community of Hebron. They buy land. Someone named Rav Malkiel Ashkenazi buys land, like we said, at the bottom of the hill. They build a market. They build houses, and they build a very beautiful small synagogue, which of course is named after the hero of Hebron, Avraham Avinu, right? Abraham the Patriarch. The stories are about, a famous story here is that there was one year there was a plague, and it was Yom Kippur, and there wasn't a minyan of Jews to pray in the synagogue. 9 men show up the eve of Yom Kippur. They're about to say Kol Nidre. It's very disturbing. How can we pray without a minyan? And then some little old man shows up, prays with them all of Yom Kippur. At the end of the day, they're all arguing who's going to take him home to break the fast. And as they look around for him, he's gone, right? We have a lot of stories like that. Usually those stories are ascribed, who's the old man? Eliyahu, right? Elijah the prophet. But since we're in Hebron, it's Avraham Avinu, and this is his synagogue. This synagogue is desecrated, not destroyed, but desecrated terribly in 1929. And again, Ben Zion Tavger is the person who comes and restores it. And today it's just a beautiful kind of a gem-like little synagogue in the middle of the Avraham Avinu neighborhood. But let's just continue our story into modern times. Late 19th, early 20th century, the city expands. The Slobodka yeshiva comes from Europe, right? In those days, everybody wore hats and suits. This is the altar of Slobodka, and the yeshiva is actually in the part of Hebron that today is under the Palestinian Authority. This beautiful building on the right here becomes what's known as Beit Hadassah. It's built as not as a health clinic, but it becomes one of the first Hadassah health clinics in the land of Israel. And everything seems to be growing and thriving until 1929. And 1929, the Arabs hear rumors that the Jews are going to be attacking on the Temple Mount. Of course, this is untrue. There are terrible riots all over the country. We're going to see 1929 also hits Gush Etzion, the very beginnings of Gush Etzion. Jerusalem, Tzfat, Tiberias, everywhere. There are wherever there's Jewish communities, there are terrible Arab riots. The worst massacres are in Hebron. The synagogues are desecrated. The graves are desecrated. 69 Jews are killed. This is horrible in and of itself. It's even more shocking because the Jews really felt that they had good relationships with the Arabs. There were a lot of business relationships, friendly relationships. Jews took refuge in the house of Eliezer Slonim, a descendant of Menucha Rochel, who had a good relationship with the Arabs. They come to him, they say, listen, give us the Ashkenazi Jews, we'll spare the Sephardi Jews. Of course, he refuses, and everybody is murdered. The British do very little to help. The High Commissioner Chancellor comes, I've learned with horror of the atrocious acts, but nobody's really punished, and in the end, it's really the effective end of the Jewish community, even though it's going to be another 19 years before this becomes under control of Jordan. But there's very little Jewish presence in Hebron after 1929. 1967, Hebron is conquered along with Gush Etzion, along with all of the areas of Judea and Samaria, but Jews are not allowed to return there. We're going to see Gush Etzion is very much an exception, that Jews are allowed to rebuild there very soon after the Six-Day War. But everywhere else, except for Jerusalem, Jews are not allowed to go and build. It's unclear what's going to be. Are we going to use these places as a bargaining chip to have peace with the Arabs? The government doesn't want to make any decisions, and Jews are not allowed to return. And then there are Jews who decide to take matters into their own hands. So this gentleman is Rav Moshe Levinger. He gets together a group of Jews who rent out a hotel in Hebron, obviously Arab owned. They come and they say, we want to spend Passover in Hebron. Will you rent out the hotel? We'll kosher the kitchen. Fine. Money changes hands. But when Passover is over, they don't leave. Right? They're settling in. They're not going anywhere. And eventually, sorry, we'll get to that in a minute. It's a standoff with the government. It's not a standoff with the Arabs, right? The government are the ones in control. It's a standoff with the government. Ultimately, they decide that they cannot stay in Hebron, but they can establish a town nearby that's called Kiryat Arba, right? In the Bible, Kiryat Arba and Hebron are the same place. Kiryat Arba hi Hebron. But in modern times, Kiryat Arba and Hebron are two different places. Hebron is the mixed Arab-Palestinian city. Kiryat Arba is a completely Jewish city today with about 7,000 people, very eclectic population. And that is established in the mid-70s. In 1979, a group of women and children from Hebron say, we don't want this. We want to be able, from Kiryat Arba, say we want to be able to live in Hebron. Kiryat Arba is very nice, but we want to be able to live in Hebron. And they move into Beit Hadassah. Okay, Beit Hadassah had been abandoned. They move in, they break into the building, they set up camp inside. They say, we're not leaving until Jews are allowed to return to Hebron. It's again a standoff. The government says the army can protect you, but you can't leave. You can't leave. For no reason can you leave. No going back and forth. And it's a standoff between the women and the children and the government. What brings things to a halt is that in about a year later, there are 6 yeshiva students every Friday night. Yeshiva students from Kiryat Arba would come down to Beit Hadassah and stand outside and sing the Shabbat prayers and do the Kiddush for the women inside. And one Friday night, 6 yeshiva students were attacked and killed. And at that point, 1980, Menachem Begin's government, he allows Jewish settlement in Hebron. So that's the return of Jews to Hebron. But like we said, complicated, not allowed to live everywhere, and not a very large number. Let's go to the Ma'ara, to the story of the Cave of the Patriarchs, because that's very important. And we want to spend a little time on it before we get to Gush Etzion. Today, the cave is divided post 1994. As we said, there's an entrance for Jews, there's an entrance for Arabs. The top picture that you're seeing is the way the Jews come in. The bottom picture is the way the Arabs come in. 2 separate entrances. One cannot be reached from the other unless you're a soldier in the Israeli army, right? You have completely different ways to get in. 10 days a year, the entire cave is opened up for Jews. Those days include Yom Kippur, a couple of the intermediate days of Sukkot and Pesach, the Shabbat where we read the parsha about buying the cave, Shabbat Chayei Sarah, and a few other times. 10 other days of the year, right? Fridays in Ramadan, the holiday of Eid al-Fitr, and a few other times. 10 alternate days, the whole cave is open for Muslims. So you have 20 days where you have exclusivity for each side, right? But other than that, completely separated. One group does not see the other. Anyone who remembers going here before 1994 will remember that you had access to all the parts of the cave and everybody was there together, but that is not the case anymore. Who's buried here? Okay, so there are different traditions among the Jews and the Arabs. The Jews say the 4 patriarchs, the 3 patriarchs and matriarchs, right? Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah, not Rachel, not Rochel. She's buried in Rachel's tomb, Kever Rochel. Okay. The Jews also add, we don't have like a specific site for it, but they say Adam and Eve are also buried here, as well as the head of Jacob's brother, Esau, right? Esav. The Arabs agree on some and not the others, right? Abraham, obviously. Isaac is switched with Ishmael, and Esav is Joseph, right? They believe that Joseph is buried here. Jews say, no, what are you talking about? Joseph is clearly buried in Shechem in the north, right? But we have those different traditions, different rooms that are ascribed to the different people. Even though everybody's buried deep under the ground, nobody's buried above ground. The large room is called Ulam Yitzchak v'Rivka, right? The Isaac and Rebekah room. This is the room that's most of the time is only for Muslims. The 2 smaller rooms are Abraham and Sarah and Jacob and Leah, right? But everybody is buried way underneath the ground. Underground, not so easy to get to. 2 attempts were made to go underground and to see what's down there. Obviously, you cannot do any kind of excavation in the cave. That would be very, very incendiary. But in 1968, there was a young girl named Michal Arbel who volunteered to go down to a small opening below ground that was really only big enough for a young woman. Girl, she was 12 years old, and she went down and she saw what you can see here on the bottom, right? A long corridor leading to a room that had one cave and another cave inside it, which is very interesting because Machpelah, which is the Hebrew name of the cave, literally means doubled, right? A cave within a cave. And that's really what she saw. There was another attempt to go down in the 80s, but really there's a lot more to be discovered that we don't know about. What we do know is that there are graves down there that go down to Byzantine times. So people did continue to bury here. Outside of the Herodian building, right? Herod builds that building outside. Outside, we have some graves that are called shaft graves. How did people bury in the time of the patriarchs? Not like they buried in first and second temple times in burial caves where they laid the body out, but in shaft graves, right? Which are like 1 to 2 meters deep, where the bodies were put in standing up. Okay, and this is echoed in the language that Jacob uses when he talks about telling Joseph. He says, "Bring me back to the grave I have dug for myself." Okay, in Hebron, the Hebrew word is kariti, like it's sort of like a mine. I dug a shaft deep into the ground, and we have found these shaft graves in the vicinity of the cave, and that tells us really that we do have graves here that go back to patriarchal times, okay, to biblical times. Of course, this cave has been fought over for centuries. Okay? Jews, Muslims, Christians all see it as holy. I always find it slightly disturbing. Really, this is a place where we could say, right, the 3 Abrahamic religions, everybody sees their roots here. Shouldn't we all get along? Not exactly. Right? And everybody has shut everybody out and fought with everybody else. When you go into the cave, you can see inscriptions and writing in Arabic. The actual assignation of the different rooms is from the time of the Crusaders. Right? When the Mamluks are here, they forbid the Jews to enter the cave, and they could only go up to the 7th step outside. So there's been a lot of competition over the cave and who is allowed to be there and who is allowed to pray there. But ultimately, everybody sees this site as holy. So maybe one day we can all learn how to share it together. For the last piece, the last quarter of our time together, we're going to talk about Gush Etzion. Okay. And like I said, place that is close to my heart. Okay? Gush Etzion, we're going to talk about the history of Gush Etzion, but just where are we talking about when we talk about Gush Etzion? The heart, the original part of Gush Etzion is the area over here between Beit Lechem and Hebron, right? Here's Bethlehem. Here's Hebron down here. Okay, today we also have the communities of Eastern Gush Etzion over here. Okay, those were not the original communities that were before 48, but those are very much important communities that also have a lot of ancient history connected to them. Okay, so we have Western Gush Etzion and Eastern Gush Etzion. We're going to mostly talk about Western, but the Eastern is also very interesting. Maybe we'll do another Zoom one day about Herodian right here near Tekoa. But that's the area that we are talking about. Also, obviously, in the mountains. This area, Gush Etzion, is a modern name. The communities that we're talking about here are modern communities, but there are very, very ancient, deep Jewish roots in this place. Right? We have what we said, the path of the patriarchs. Right? We have that road, that ancient road. Along the ancient road, we have ritual baths that are on the road. Why are they on the road? Because people would purify themselves as they went up to the temple, as they traveled to Jerusalem. Right? So this is part of the pilgrimage route to Jerusalem that's going on here. We have aqueducts and pools and water systems that, again, bringing water to Jerusalem. This is very much a connection to Jerusalem. So the picture that you have over here on the bottom left is part of what's called the BR aqueduct, a series of aqueducts from Second Temple times, from Herodian time, Hasmonean and Herodian times, with the main kind of artery of it being huge pools called Solomon's Pools just south of Bethlehem. It's an enormous system bringing water from the springs out here by Gush Etzion all the way to the temple in Jerusalem. So very, very significant contribution to the way to life in Jerusalem. In Eastern Gush Etzion, We have the magnificent fortress of Herodian, right? One of Herod's fortresses, right? Masada is very famous, Caesarea is very famous, but Herodian is fabulous and is important, and I personally think is more interesting than Masada. So we have a lot, and besides the kind of spectacular things that we're looking at here, we have a lot of just remains of small farming communities with wine presses, with olive presses, right? And they're scattered all around Gush Etzion. Now, the return to Zion, with Jews coming back in the beginnings of Zionism in the 1880s and the 1900s, at first Jews do not move into the mountains. Okay, the mountains are considered to be very heavily settled by the Arabs. They're not interested in selling land. Jews buy along the coast, they buy in the Jezreel Valley, but in the 1920s, there's an understanding that, wait a second, this is the heartland. This is the place where we should be settling. And there are attempts at settlement. Now, there are 3 attempts, 2 fail and 1 succeed. In 1920s, you have a community called Migdal Eder. It starts, it grows, and 1929 riots, it's cut down. 1930s, you have a second attempt. A company that's called El Hahar. It's founded by this gentleman over here, Shmuel Holtzman. He's an interesting guy. He was a businessman. He had connections all over the world. He had gold mines in Australia. He brought ostrich feathers. He imported an exotic fruit, and he did all kinds of interesting things. One of his sidelines was he bought land in this area. Okay, now the name of this community that he buys, right, this whole area, this block that he buys, he names it after himself. That's where the name Gush Etzion comes from. Gush means a block of settlements. Okay? Etzion, he names the community Kfar Etzion, the village of Etzion. Etzion has nothing to do, you're looking at it, you're saying Zion, Sion, nothing to do with that. Etz means tree. Holtz, his name is Shmuel Holtzman. Holtz means wood. Kfar Etzion, Mr. Holtzman's village. That's basically what he calls it. Hey, he buys all this land, but again, riots in 1936, the Arabs attack, the Jews flee. In the 40s, a third attempt is made, and this time it works. Okay, 4 communities are founded: the Kfar Etzion, named after Mr. Holtzman, Ein Surim, Masuot Yitzchak, and Rivadim. These are 3 religious and 1 secular community pioneers, many of them coming from war-torn Europe, okay, getting out, finding their way to the land of Israel, and starting to rebuild their lives. Some of them are the last survivors of their families. 43, 44, 45, okay. We have this amazing document. We have a lot of photographs from the old Gush Etzion. Anyone who lives here or is coming to visit here, there's an incredible audiovisual presentation in the rebuilt, the renewed Kfar Etzion that tells the story of these people and really gets to the idea that these are survivors. These are Holocaust survivors who want to rebuild and who understand that they can't move anymore. This is the last stop. And in 1944, they plant trees and they write something called the Scroll of Planting, Megillat HaNetiyot. And it's really Megillat HaNetiyah. It's so evocative of who they are and what they're dealing with. On the 26th of Shvat, 5704, 1944, in the 5th year of the Second World War, a year after our ascent to Kfar Etzion, we, the members of Kfutzat Avraham of the Poel Mizrahi, right, that's their group name, approached to plant fruit and forest trees in Kfar Etzion to fulfill what is written in the Torah. And when you come to the land, you will plant. The earth was not created for chaos, but to be settled. Okay, so far so good, right? Shvat, Tu B'Shvat, planting trees, very nice. But now we understand who these people are. At the time when rivers of our brothers' blood are spilled like water and the world is drowning in blood, we came here to build and plant and strike deep roots in the mountains of Judah. With these plantings, we open a door to our redemption and salvation. We were rootless in the exile, and that rootlessness was a terrible disease of our nation while in a strange land. We need roots. We need to have a strong hold in our homeland. That is the work that we are doing in this place. Okay? And they need to take hold of the land and to stay. Okay? The picture that you're seeing here is what's called the German monastery, one of the important buildings in Kfar Etzion,